If you try to speak English with good grammar, then you might be surprised to learn that native English speakers ignore several grammatical rules all the time. You can try to speak with perfect grammar if you want to, but again, do not be surprised if most, if not all, native English speakers communicate in a totally different way. Today, I'll show you some of the most common grammatical rules that native English speakers break. This will also show you how to communicate like a native English speaker. I'm a native English speaker and I've helped many people with their English over the years. Very soon, I will be releasing a free crash course showing you the fastest ways to become fluent in English by yourself from anywhere in the world. If you'd like to learn more about that, I will leave a link somewhere in the description or pinned comment below. Now, the first rule that we tend to break is that native English speakers tend to end sentences with prepositions, such as in, on, or at. This is traditionally considered to be incorrect grammar. For example, you were probably taught to say, "Where are you?" when you're asking where somebody is. However, very often native English speakers will say, "Where are you at?" Now, "where you at" is pretty informal, and not everybody does this, but I would still say it is pretty common among native English speakers. So if you notice that native English speakers say, "Where are you at with this?" or "Where are you at?" just in general, do keep in mind that it is incorrect grammar. However, it is how native English speakers tend to communicate with one another. Now, the next rule that native English speakers break would be split infinitives. Essentially, this just means the incorrect use of an adverb. For example, a native English speaker might say he boldly went somewhere where he wasn't supposed to, or he boldly went somewhere that no one has gone before. The correct form would be he went boldly where no one had gone before. It's just the order of the adverb. If you're someone who's learning English in school or out of a book, they might teach you a certain order to arrange an adverb and a verb. But with native English speakers, we don't really care. We'll just use any order that sounds right to us. So, as you're learning English grammar, it is true if you have an English test in school, they might grade you upon your correct use of grammar. But in real life, native English speakers do not even give a second thought to grammatical rules such as this. The third rule that we break would be double negatives. Now, to be fair, this rule is usually broken when us native English speakers are speaking very informally with one another. Standard English typically doesn't allow double negatives, they usually cancel each other out. So, for example, you might hear a native English speaker say, "I don't know nothing." The correct form would be to say, "I don't know anything." I don't know nothing, or I ain't know nothing. This is just a super informal way that native English speakers sometimes communicate if they're trying to be funny, if they're trying to be loose and laid back, or if they just prefer to speak informally instead of formally. You don't have to speak like this, but it's good for you to know. The next rule that we break is using less instead of fewer. Less is used for uncountable nouns, and fewer is used for countable nouns. But as native English speakers, this thought never crosses our mind. For example, a native English speaker would say something like, "There are less apples on the tree." But technically, the correct form would be, "There are fewer apples on the tree." This is good to know if you have an English test in school, but native English speakers use these two words interchangeably. Less and fewer essentially mean the same thing to us. The fifth rule that we tend to break is misplacing commas in compound sentences. In compound sentences, commas should separate independent clauses if a conjunction is used. So, to give an example to illustrate this, a lot of the time when native English speakers write, we would say, "I went to the store and I bought some goods." We wouldn't even use a comma in that entire sentence. However, technically, the correct form would be I went to the store, comma, and I bought some goods. The next rule that we break would be dangling modifiers. So, simply put, this just means forming complete sentences versus not forming complete sentences. So, for example, a native English speaker would say, walking to the store, the rain started. Technically, if you wanted to be grammatically correct, you would say, walking to the store, I saw that the rain started. When it comes to writing, I do recommend using complete sentences because it leaves out ambiguity and it specifies exactly what you're trying to say. But again, don't be surprised if native English speakers do not use complete sentences and they just expect you to understand what the context of what they're saying is. The next rule that we break, well, it's not really a rule, but I would say it would be overusing the word literally and also misusing the word literally. Literally means in a real, literal sense, but we often just use it as a filler word to emphasize something else that we're trying to say. There are many words like this in the English language that are misused by native English speakers. For example, a lot of native English speakers might say, I was literally dying of laughter. So obviously, they were not literally dying, or else they would be dead. But they will just misuse the word literally just to put emphasis on something being very funny. The correct way to say this expression grammatically would be, I was dying of laughter, or I was dying from laughter. So the next time you hear a native English speaker use the word literally, do not take it literally. They're probably just using it as a filler word to emphasize something that they're saying. And I also want you to have the same mindset for many other words that are used as filler words for native English speakers. Literally is just a one word of many other words that English speakers misuse or overuse. The next rule that we break is using me instead of I in compound subjects. Simply put, using I is the correct term to use, but many native English speakers tend to use me. I even remember growing up in school and learning to use I instead of me, but I still hear lots of native English speakers use them interchangeably, whichever feels right to them at the time. For example, you might hear a native English speaker say, John and me are going to the park. But the grammatically correct way to say it is, John and I are going to the park. Now, me personally, as a native English speaker, I tend to use the grammatically correct rule for this particular situation. But I would not say that I'm necessarily most people. I hear native English speakers all the time misuse the term me when they should be using I. So that's something you should get used to, but just know in the back of your head, I is the correct term. Another rule that we break is using good instead of well for adverbs. Simply put, good is an adjective used to describe something. Well is an adverb that describes how something is done. For example, you'll hear a lot of native English speakers say something like, she sings good, but the correct form would be, she sings well. This is another situation where I personally tend to use the term well instead of good when you're describing how someone is doing something, but you'll hear them used interchangeably depending on where you are in the world. In some parts of the world, the term well is more commonly used in this situation, and in some parts of the world, good is more commonly used. Well is grammatically correct in this situation, but keep in mind that native English speakers don't really care about these two words not being interchangeable. And the last one that we'll look at today is the incorrect use of who and whom. Who is a subject pronoun and whom is an object pronoun. For example, a lot of native English speakers will just say, who did you give it to? When technically, the grammatically correct way of saying it is, whom did you give it to? Me personally, I break this rule all the time. I don't really care about who and whom. I even think it sounds kind of goofy if you say whom. So I break this rule all the time. I'm guilty of it. And plenty of other native English speakers I know as well also just say who. I think most native English speakers that I know actually almost never say whom. It almost sounds overly formal to a lot of native English speakers. Now, if you use this term in a grammatically correct way, and a lot of native English speakers are looking at you funny or scratching their head, it's just because this is not really thought of very deeply by native English speakers. This rule is broken all the time. So, if you want to speak like a native English speaker, I would ignore all 10 of these grammatical rules. Now, keep in mind, you don't need to necessarily communicate like a native English speaker, but it's still very good for you to know if you're going to be communicating with native English speakers and you want to understand the context of their grammatical mistakes. And this is also a sign that you should not be worried or anxious if you make grammatical mistakes when you speak, because even native English speakers break grammatical rules all the time. Now, leave a comment down below telling me where you're from and what your native language is. I would be very curious to know. Also, keep in mind that most native English speakers are around the C1 level of English. If you want to learn what it takes to get all the way to the C2 level of English, then be sure to watch this next video.